listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio. The following presentation is entitled Wicked Women of the Bible, Part 3, Herodias. Enjoy and have a glorious day.
Herod Antipas, who we're talking about, his wife Herodias, but she was originally married to his brother Herod Philip I. Isn't that correct?
That is correct. Maybe I could give you a quick sketch of the Herods, because I know when I first started reading the Bible, it was really confusing to me. Herod this, Herod that, who's who. So remember that the Herod the Great, he was the first, and he was the one that tried to kill the infant Jesus and ended up slaughtering all the baby boys in Bethlehem. So that was Herod Antipas's father and Herodias's grandfather. So Herod the Great, why was he great? He was great because he was a great builder. He built a lot of things. But he was greatly paranoid, and he ended up killing one of his wives and several of his children because of his paranoia. So he actually killed Herodias's father, even though she was one of his favorite grandchildren. Okay, so back to Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was already married by the time he met Herodias. Herodias was married to Antipas's half-brother, Philip I. There must have been some kind of mutual attraction between the two, and Herod Antipas wanted to marry Herodias. Herodias insisted that he divorce if he was going to marry her, so he did that. So she married essentially her uncle. She had been married to one of her uncles. She left him to marry another uncle, Herod Antipas.
And what did she gain by marrying her own uncle?
One could speculate. Philip was a landless. He really wasn't a ruler. He was landless. He didn't have a lot of power. And it was likely, from what we can see of Herodias, at least in the scripture, that she was ambitious. And Antipas seemed to have a lot more going for him. He was a ruler, he had ambitions, so perhaps it was that attraction to power.
So obviously she was very ambitious, but how was her marriage to Herod Antipas received among the leadership of Galilee and Samaria?
Well, it depends on what leadership you're looking at. If it was the Romans, I think they could care less. But among the Jews, it was an object of a lot of controversy, because for Herod to marry his niece, who was already married to his brother, was considered immoral and incestuous. So, in fact, it was a problem for him among the Jewish people.
So it was scandalous already?
Yes.
Why did Herod imprison John the Baptist?
Well, John the Baptist is this another amazing character, like we talked about Elijah being so bold. Well, John the Baptist, was this incredibly bold prophet and prophetic character. He was free to speak his mind, and he was free to speak the truth to power. And so he publicly denounced this marriage, and that infuriated Antipas, but it made Herodias even more angry. How dare this, this rustic prophet speak negatively about her relationship with Herod Antipas. So that's how the whole thing started with John the Baptist. And John had a lot of followers who loved him, so he could potentially lead an insurrection. And so Herod Antipas had him imprisoned.
And that's why you think he wasn't executed immediately?
Well, it's interesting because the Gospels seem to indicate that Herod was fascinated by John. You even get the feeling that maybe he was tempted to, go down and let John baptize him in the Jordan River. But, of course, he doesn't do that. But he wants to hear John preach, so he's interested in him. But he's also wary of John because he doesn't want to get the populace any more riled up than they already are. So he thinks if he, martyrs this man, if he kills him, that the ordinary people will be incensed, and that will destabilize his kingdom.
So it's a political smart move to keep John in prison but not execute him.
It seems like it.
Well, Herodias was obviously very manipulative. to get what she wanted. But what about Salome? Do you think she was as wicked as her mother?
Yeah, interesting question. Salome probably was a young girl, not very old. But sometimes the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree, and she seemed very willing to be the pawn of her mother. So you could say, well, okay, maybe the dance wasn't so much a problem, but, asking her mother, as the story unfolds, she does this dance that may have been, very suggestive. And by now, it's Herod's birthday party. All the guests plus Herod are probably have drank too much. They're having a great old time. There's this young girl, and she finishes her dance in front of Herod, and he's, superlative in his praise, and he says, I'll give you anything you want, up to half your kingdom. And so she goes to her mother and says, hey, Mommy, what should I ask for? And Herodias is very quick with the answer, I want John's head on a platter. So Salome takes that to Herod, and because Herod doesn't want to be embarrassed in front of his guests, he does what he thinks he shouldn't and sends the executioner to behead John the Baptist. So you could say, yes, Salome is certainly complicit in the sense that she took this and willingly made this her request before Herod. So I think she does bear blame, but of course Herodias is the adult, she was sort of the mastermind, if you will.
And as such, how does her story actually end, the story of Herodias?
We don't really know. What we do know is there was trouble. Herod Antipas had divorced his wife, who happened to be this Nabatean princess, and her daddy didn't like that. And so it created a lot of tension, and eventually there was war with that king, and so that destabilized the area. And eventually Herodias' brother Agrippa, these Herods, you have to imagine there's a lot of scheming behind the scenes. Agrippa goes to the emperor of Rome, basically tells a lot of half-truths and lies about Herod and Herodias, to the point where the emperor banishes them to this backwater in the empire in Gaul. And so Herod dies there, and Herodias, who must have been ambitious, her ambitions must have died there, but we don't really know exactly what happened to her.
So what can we gain and glean from the life of Herodias?
Well, it's not exactly an inspiring story, is it? But I think when you think about her story, you think that she had some opportunity probably to hear something of the gospel. She may have heard John preach. Joanna and her husband were in the court of Herod, so she may have known them. They were followers, or Joanna was a follower of Jesus. So she may have actually heard about Jesus in the gospel. She may have later, when Herod was in Jerusalem during Passover, and you remember that Jesus was sent to Herod, and they kind of had a mock trial. She probably was in the city then, so she would have known about Jesus. She would have had an opportunity, in other words, to break with her family tradition, break with that awful, evil kind of line of Herods that were concerned with power at any cost, and convert to the gospel, but she didn't. So I think, no matter what our, stretching it a bit, but no matter where we come from, it requires a decision. It requires a conversion of heart. I think a lot of what we can take from the story is that there will be opposition to the gospel. Not everybody thinks of the gospel as good news, and certainly she didn't think of it as good news. And then when you look a little bit at the life of John the Baptist, he's amazing. He was maybe the freest man in the story, the freest man in the Gospels aside from Jesus, because he didn't fear for his own life. Or if he did fear for it, he didn't put that top shelf, so he was not afraid to speak the truth.
Well, ultimately what cost him his life is that boldness in speaking against the immorality and, isn't it, illegality of their marriage? What can we take away from John's boldness in the face of such danger?
Yeah, I think, I feel this very strongly myself as a Christian who's always lived in America, that I've got it so easy and so cushy. And I wonder, what would I do if push came to shove and my life was at stake for speaking out or standing fast? And I look at my brothers and sisters right now in different parts of the world, and particularly in the Middle East, And I've heard amazing stories about how Christians there have stood fast at the cost of their lives. So I guess this is a startling story. I hope it will startle me awake to the challenges of what it means really to be faithful as a Christian. I pray that God would give us all strength to stand up to those who don't think the gospel is the good news. Stand up in loving ways, but not give in. So I guess to me it's kind of an astringent, it can wake us up to our call as Christians, particularly when we're living in a society where, we aren't called to suffer very much for the most part.
Well, thank you so much, Anne, for sharing us about Herodias and Salome. This has been a great conversation.
Thanks, Lori.
You are listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio.